As we pray this evening, if you could please keep in mind the community of Corpus Christi and Sacred Heart of Jesus who are dealing with the loss of a student on the weekend. So if you could keep them and the family in our prayers. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, give me enough tears to keep me human, enough humor to keep me wise, enough setbacks to keep me humble, enough accomplishments to keep me confident, enough patience to teach me how to wait, enough hope to teach me how to trust, enough friends to give me love, enough memories to comfort me, and enough faith to keep me going. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
Just ask for an addition, if it's all right with the group, and that is just maybe if we could have under information or miscellaneous, just a quick discussion about the executive compensation policy that we as a board voted on that was to come to the policy committee. I know it wasn't meant to be on this agenda here, but maybe just have a quick discussion on where we want it to go and when we want it to come up again.
Executive compensation?
Please, yes.
So it's going to be 5.4 under information.
Okay.
Can I also add an item? I'm just wondering about the when we were going to get back information about the volunteer hours. That was sort of left, I don't know if...
Trustee Carabella, you want to add an information item about volunteer hours?
Yes, and how that discussion.
Discussion about volunteer hours?
Yes.
That will be item 5.4. We're just going through the approval of the agenda, and a couple of board members have added items. I have some when you're ready, Dave. Okay. Move the agenda. Trustee Marai, seconded by Trustee Michael. Thank you. So the changes to the agenda are item 5.4, a discussion of executive compensation. 5.5, volunteer hours discussion. 5.6, marijuana on school property. 5.7, use of school-generated funds, discussion. And the last change was demoting the item 3.3, school uniform dress code, to the last item as an action item, and the others move up. Can I call a vote to approve the agenda as amended? Trustee Trites, seconded by Trustee Carabella. All in favor? Okay. Everybody's in favor. Anyone opposed? Seeing none. Okay, so that the agenda is approved as amended, can I have a mover for the minutes? Trustee Antomasi, seconded by Trustee Marai. How do the minutes look? Questions, comments, discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the minutes? Favor. Any opposed? I see no one opposed to the minutes. Thank you. Okay, so action item 3.1. Can I have a mover for policy I-22, admission to schools? Moved by Trustee Rowe, seconded by Trustee Trites. Thank you. Superintendent Overholt.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the policy before you, admissions to school, elementary and secondary policy I-22, is being brought forward. It is somewhat out of sequence on our list that we had. However, our director received a call from the Ombudsman recently in regards to our policy related to admissions, specifically when it comes to students who word that is out there, however it's not in Ontario law, is emancipated, but basically a student who is withdrawn from parental support, which is the common terminology in Ontario. And obviously need to address that within our policies and our procedures when it comes to a student who is in that position, 16 years of age or older, who has withdrawn from family support. So we had taken a look at our policy and did some changes to include some aspects of that within the policy and the requirements you'll see on page 2 of 2 on that, page 7, I guess, I think in the package, where a student who is 16 years of age or older and has indicated if withdrawn from parental control is required to show proof of new address and indicate in writing they have withdrawn from parental control. We've added as well, parents are required to register their child and submit required documentation. And a student who withdraws from parental support who is registering at a school is required to submit also the necessary documentation, as would a parent. And what we have included as well is the documentation that would be required. We've added that to the policy so that everyone is well aware of those. I want to kind of do a amendment, and we weren't quick enough to do it because I just found out and got verification this morning from the health department. We are no longer going to be required to ask parents to show proof of immunization. They're going through a process where they will have the ability to check students who are in our system to be able to identify if they are fully immunized or not. So that process of us now checking the immunization, what used to happen was we would require it, so parents would go to the health department, they would get the documentation, they would show it to us, and we would copy it and fax it back to the health department. So it was kind of a process where we're duplicating what was needed. So that will be one kind of coming forward that will be coming out, but we just got verification this morning that that is going to be the new process. So those are the changes, and certainly open to any questions you may have. Not us ourselves. What happens is there is nothing in the Education Act that requires us to be checking immunization. It's through the Immunization Act where the health departments have that requirement to make sure students have the proper immunization. So it is them who is the onus on them. They have a system called Panorama, which is across the province that all school boards are part of, where students' information is put into that, and they're able to verify those immunization records. And that's why they're going through that ISPA process, where they're making sure that all students right now, they're going for all our grade 9 to 12 students are fully immunized and getting opportunities to get immunized, and they're also just starting with our younger ones this year as well. And hopefully over the next couple of years, they will have reached everybody and they'll be caught up, and they'll be able to check those on a regular basis. Okay, so comments, questions? Trustee Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just concerned about the process that the health the authority will follow when they discover someone's missing. I mean, up to now, then if something's missing, the parents being sent anyways by the school to get it sorted out. So in the middle of December, when they finally catch up with some kid, are they going to kick him out of school on the spot? Like, how are they going to handle this?
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, they would not. Right now, again, we have for the last 2 years, and this is the third year, they have given notice to families well in advance. In the summertime, they have again given them in October, and they're giving them again in November. So they're giving them lots of notices to say, you know, our records show that your immunization is not up to date. Right now, they're providing some opportunities within the secondary schools for those immunization shots to take place with consent, as well as opportunities for them to go to their family doctors. There is definitely a PR campaign going on through the region and throughout the regions in the province to make sure that parents are aware that immunizations need to be updated and forwarded to them. So if they don't, then it's the health department that would be in contact with the family. We would only be informed after they've been told for numerous times, and we've been in working with them to say this is the date as to which, if they haven't been immunized, then suspensions would occur. We had very few over the last couple of years that has taken place when this process has happened for the target groups that they're going with right now.
Trustee Michael?
Or, no, if they caught up with him, let's say in December, and he wouldn't be. But when those notices go home, they say you can't come back to school until you bring an immunization record current. So they follow through on those, right?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if they get a notification that, and again, we've been giving them the date as to when that suspension is going to take place, so they have up to, again, we usually are having it this year. It's going to be February, mid-February, I think the date is. If it gets to that point, again, in the past we've had 2 or 3. We started off with probably 500-600. We've got down to 2 or 3. They are very quick afterwards. It is a 20-day suspension, but as soon as they are fully immunized, they can come back. The suspension stops, and they are back at school.
Trustee Carabello?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I'm just wondering, for when a student withdraws from parental control, does that mean the student is not living at the parent's address or with the parents?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, that is our indication, is that they are no longer probably living at that address, and one thing we are asking for is where their residence is. We have in the procedures, which you'll see afterwards, we've asked, there's a template letter that we're asking the student to fill out that indicates where their address is and how they are supporting themselves.
Trustee Carabello?
Thank you. Through Mr. Chair. Another point, I have 1 and 2 actually. One is under the principles. I was wondering if the same way we did in the participation in programs and courses of studying Catholic religious education, there's a bullet, this is the amendment I made for that particular policy, and I thought it could fit very well in here to just fully explain the Catholic faith. So under principles, I would like to add, it's exactly the same wording. The board is committed to cultivating the special characteristics of Catholic education to teach the authentic truths of the faith in line with the magisterium of the Church and in cooperation with the bishops in the exercise of their teaching office.
Are you moving that as amendment, or?
Yes, I would, if that's the way. Yes, I would. We can have a discussion and then to move it as an amendment to add that to clarify the Catholic teaching, the Catholic faith.
Can I have a seconder, please? Trustee Rabenda, thank you. Discussion? Trustee Trice.
I think that would fit in nicely.
Trustee Michael?
Would you mind repeating that? It seems to be like more than one part to me, and I want to hear it again.
My pleasure. The board is committed to cultivating the special characteristics of Catholic education, to teach the authentic truths of the faith in line with the magisterium of the Church and in cooperation with the bishops in the exercise of their teaching office. And just to say that this is exactly what is in our operating policy for participation in programs and courses of study in Catholic religious education that we just amended in October.
Any other comments, questions? Trustee Rowe?
Just a question, is there any exceptions to students with the Eastern Rite that this would not apply to? I don't know.
Anyone else? Trustee Moran?
Yeah, this is just the same issue as last time. You may just want to get rid of the first bullet then, because it's kind of redundant just to say it twice. You're talking about...
Yeah.
So maybe just use one or the other, would be my suggestion.
I think that if the amendment's adopted, then it makes that first bullet redundant. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to call a vote then on that amendment. All in favor? Any opposed? I see no one opposed, so that carries. Now we're back to the main policy. Trustee Rowe.
Just a question under the requirements. Should the third bullet, which is the second new bullet, should it be the first? Because it just seems out of place. Because we're talking about the student, and then we have the parents in the middle. Should we put the parents? So under requirements, secondary.
On requirements.
2.2, page 2.2. 2.2. So it's about the students, but the parents are required to register their child and submit. It almost seems to be a contradiction of the previous one, but you do require the parents to show up at the high school, correct? So I'm not sure whether it should be reworded or put first or something like that.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I guess this normal procedures is the parents are going to be registering their child. 99 times out of 100, it's going to be the parent. So it may make sense to reorder it so that it is a natural that those are the ones that we're making sure that they bring in documentation. So are you thinking it should be bullet number 3 as opposed to 4? Number 1?
Then all the rest talk about the students.
Okay, yep.
Okay, I don't think an amendment's necessary for that. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Trustee Carabella.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So I had a clarification question on the administrative procedure. So it's page 43 of our package. It has to do with the school support. So I'm just trying to understand. So when people ask me if they have a student at a public school and a student at a Catholic school, where does the support go? Because this policy seemed like we're asking them to support the Catholic school, which is good. But I'm wondering, can we do that, or do people follow up with that, or can you somehow have the household split that the men or the woman goes either?
Director Dawson.
Just for clarification, thank you.
Superintendent.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. No, it's one household that is directing. So when they do come to register with us, we certainly are asking them, and in the secondary school, obviously because of open access, we still are trying to want our taxes to be directed, support ratepayers to support Catholic system. Can we force that? No, but it is something that we are continually, when they do come to register, are asking in terms of that support as to which way they're directed towards. And also we continue to try to put it out there in our system. I think we've put it on our website, we've put it to our parishes, so we continue to do that as well.
Thank you.
Trustee Quinn, we're still on item 3.1, admission to schools policy. We're just debating it. So Superintendent Overholt, you mentioned it has to be one or the other, right? It can't be both, and it's on the property roll that it's associated with. Any further comments, questions? Trustee Quinn?
I was cut off on my phone when Trustee Rowe was asking his question, but how many people would this addition to the policy affect? Those who are emancipating themselves from their parents, and how many would be in our board right now in that position?
Through you, Mr. Chair. I don't have that number. I would say it is a very minimal number of students in our system. I would say single digits, but again, I don't have the exact number. I can find it out for you. Yeah.
And when it came to the vaccinations, right now, I believe parents are allowed to exclude their children from vaccinations. Would these emancipated children be able to remove themselves from the vaccination process, or do they still, under the Education Act, have to be vaccinated because they're in the classrooms without parental guidance?
Through you, Mr. Chair, they would have to go through the same process to get an exemption from the medical officer of health from the region. I would assume, and again, I don't know, if they are declaring that they are withdrawing support from a parent, I would assume that they would be able to do the same process through getting an exemption from the health department. By the time they're 16, again, not saying that they are, but hopefully that they have received all their immunizations, but if they're not, and they would be able to go and get that exemption through the health department.
Trustee Michael?
Through you, Superintendent Overholt. If you're emancipated and you're under the age of majority, wouldn't you have to have a guardian?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it can only be, they have to be at least 16 or older. Yeah.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I'll call a vote on this policy as amended. All in favor? Any opposed? I see no one opposed. So that carries. Okay, moving on to item 3.2. Can I have a mover for policy I-44? Trustee Marai, seconded by Trustee Iantomasi. Strategic planning policy. Superintendent Nagoy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before you, trustees have the revised strategic planning policy with track changes, incorporating the feedback from the stakeholder consultation, and also attached in Appendix A of your report is the details of the stakeholder feedback. And I'd be happy to take any questions trustees may have.
Thank you, Superintendent. Comments, questions? Trustee Marai.
I'd just like to add stakeholders are ratepayers, staff, students, parents, priests, and parish representatives, community members and partners, and other interested persons or agencies, because ratepayers are the people who pay for everything we have.
Are you making an amendment? Can I have a seconder, please? Trustee Traits? Discussion on the amendment. Okay, thank you. Trustee Traits.
Through you, Mr. Chair, may I add to the amendment that it be all Catholic ratepayers residing in the Halton region? Would that work for you, Paul? Sure. Yeah, then we zero rate in. Okay. So I don't know if that's an amendment to the amendment. Over to you.
It's not hostile. It's not hostile amendment, so. I think that's what you meant anyways, right? Yeah. Further discussion on this amendment? Okay, seeing none, so I'll vote on the amendment to include that definition of Catholic ratepayers as a stakeholder. All in favor? Any opposed? See no one opposed. Okay, so back to the main policy. Questions, comments, concerns? Okay, so this is going to go to the December 5th board meeting for approval in second and third reading. So that means it'll need 7 votes to carry, right? If I'm not mistaken, 3/4 vote. So it'll need 7 votes to do that. I'll consider that a referendum on this policy. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to call Trustee Quinn.
To you, Mr. Chair, you brought this motion forward that we have a policy for strategic planning in place. How much have you contributed to this policy in your own thoughts as to what you wanted to see in a strat plan policy?
I haven't brought any direct input into the policy. I asked the staff to come up with the bulk of it based on the documents that were publicly available, things other boards were doing, guidelines that the ministry suggested. I mean, as the chair, I wanted to have a policy on the books. I think that once the policy exists, then we can certainly amend it from there. There's still time before I'm just speaking from my own opinion right now. I would like to see approval milestones. And I think there's still a lot of potential to amend this policy. For example, if early French immersion ought to be a strategic priority, then that needs to emerge somehow. And trustees need to decide whether it's a strategic priority. So if this policy is not fleshed out, in my opinion, speaking as a board member here, if it's not fleshed out that those approvals are there and how the trustees understand what the strategic priorities ought to be, then the policy should be enhanced to define how we get there, how we make priorities, how do they emerge. So this, for example, you've seen one strategic planning cycle. Everybody on this board has seen one cycle now, at least. We've seen parental feedback on a program offering, and we've seen how the threat of removing a program can cause the parents or people who are interested in specialty programs, how they respond. So sometimes when you try to remove something, you see how much it's valued by your base, by your constituency or your community. So I think that once the policy is on the books, we'll have a chance to review it again. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that. Trustee Carabella.
Well, it seems like you have a lot to add. And does it have to do third reading? Could we consider those points you just made and have a second reading and then already put some of those ideas on here?
Well, I'm not bringing any amendments forward as chair of the committee. It can definitely come up at a later time. If any trustee wants to amend the resolution to make it first reading only, by all means, you are the board acting, and you're the board members who could say, let's just pass it at first reading, so that it goes out for another cycle of. Okay, it's already passed first, or go through the process of second reading. Only, and that'll require a lower threshold at the next board meeting. So that's up to you. I'm not going to say one way or the other. If there aren't any further comments, or if no one wants to do that, I'll just call for a vote on second and third as is. Trustee Carabella.
Well, I would then put that forward as an amendment to just have it to second reading.
Okay, is there a seconder for that? Trustee Quinn? Discussion on making this second reading only. Trustee Quinn, and then Rob.
I like the idea of incorporating some of your potential recommendations to beef up the strat plan. We know how hard it is to get the entirety of our board to approve changes to policy. So let's make sure everyone's satisfied on the way through this process, so that we may not have to revisit it until the next, the next trustee council decides how they want, if they want to amend it. But let's have our policy in place so that it's solid for the next strat cycle. And if we're satisfied with it after second reading, then go ahead. But I think we don't want to get into amending policies going into turnover in the trustees.
Okay, thank you for that. Trustee Rowe?
So my question is, are you going to write up your proposals and bring it back to policy? Because otherwise there's no sense in having just second reading.
I may. I'll see what happens. I'll see what the outcome is. I'll see what the outcome of this vote is, and what happens at the December 2nd board meeting, and then I will, if I bring forward amendments on my own, and I have a seconder, and that they have some support, then I'll bring them forward. Trustee Trace.
To you, through you, with Trustee Rowe, would Janine have caught all that and work with Superintendent Overholt to maybe, with what you've heard, put in and be available at second reading? What you just said?
I didn't make any amendments, Trustee Trace.
No, I know, but could it not be captured that way? Or does it only go through amendments?
Like I say, I haven't committed anything to paper in terms of personal changes. I'm the chair of this committee.
No,
I initiated the policy, but I don't want to write the policy myself in this committee.
Okay,
That's all. Just Superintendent Overholt.
Through you, Mr. Chair, and again, I guess it depends on which way this goes. In order for us to make any more changes, we would need to know what those changes or what the additions are to that in order to bring it here for further discussion. So I guess it depends on, how the following motion gets passed here.
Precisely. So I'll just add before Trustee Marai, we're still, if it goes to second, if we take it to second reading only on December 5th, it means we can still work on it. So, okay? So, Trustee Marai.
I guess my only question is, I liked everything you said about the process and comments about, programs being taken away and all the rest, but maybe this is an obvious question, but I thought the whole point of this policy was that it was a strategic planning policy. It wasn't the strategic plan. So, so I just want to, I'm, for those items, but I'm not sure if this is the exact place, but let's have that discussion at the board and then decide what should be and what should not be in.
Thank you for that, and I'm not saying we put in something about French immersion into this policy. It's a template for the process. So we've seen the process happen in a live way with, I'm using French immersion as an example. So to incorporate that type of thing into a template is something that we're all better equipped to do now. Yantamasi.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. I guess my only thought is, generally when we do a policy, it's to leave some flexibility. So, as you've instigated here, is to have a framework, and I would rather see it stay as a framework, allowing that policy to be able to morph, as you will, as you go through the whole process, as opposed to nailing it down so hard here that we're only going to end up back in policy to revise the policy again. So I think if we leave the framework, then we've got other mechanisms down the road to change things. Plus, going into an election year, we're dictating to the next board what they have to live with.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm going to call a vote on the amended resolution to make this sent for a second reading only to the next board meeting. All in favor? Any opposed? Trustee Rowe and Trustee Rabenda. So that carries, that it's only for second reading, right? item 3.4. We're going to skip over 3.3 for now. Item 3.4, policy 3-03, teacher performance appraisal. Can I have a mover and a seconder for this one? Moved by trustee Marai, seconded by trustee Iantomasi. Discussion, or Superintendent Overholt, please.
Through you, Mr. Chair, policy 3003, teacher performance appraisal. It is mandated through the province, teacher performance appraisal for all our permanent teaching staff with the school boards in Ontario, and then the regulations are there before you that it relies on. It is a policy that was established in 1986, but through legislation, it has changed on numerous times, and one of the changes that were made was the purpose of the policy. Before it talked about the implementation. We're far beyond the implementation stage, so that purpose was changed, but also adding more detail in regards to annual learning plans that teachers have to do each year and how it relates to their performance appraisal, new teacher and a new teacher induction program, and also in regards to long-term occasional teachers and how the performance appraisal affects them as well. I would be happy to answer any questions in regards to the changes that were made in the policy.
Thank you. Trustee Quinn.
Through you, Mr. Chair, what would we expect to hear back from the bargaining units on these proposed changes?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I wouldn't see anything because this is the process that they have gone through for numerous years. It's just a matter of being a little bit more detailed in the policy to make sure it captures everything that is actually going on.
Trustee Carabella.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Where do, now with the French immersion, I learned about teachers with the letter of permission and letter of approval. Where do they fit into this process? Are they seen as new teachers, or?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, they would not be a permanent teacher. They would fall under probably an occasional teacher, and they would probably be appraised through that process because they would not be on as a permanent staff. It's on a yearly basis that they would have to get that permission.
Mr. Dawson.
Long-term occasionals don't have the same forms that the ministry puts forward for all hired teachers, new and experienced. Each school develops their own long-term occasional review, so that the more you have of those in your personnel file, then it's better equips the hiring team to know if a permanent position comes up, then you have that particular, and it's all each board does theirs a little differently, but they use similar terms, but it's not standardized like the TPA, the Teacher Performance Appraisal, or the NTIP Performance Appraisal documents.
Trustee Michael.
Following what you said, Director Dawson, through you, Mr. Chair, under definitions it says, I think what you're alluding to, Trustee Carabella, experienced teachers as opposed to the new teachers you were talking about. They have to be in maximum of 24 hours have their appraisals done for new teachers, and then their experience, and that includes those teaching on a letter of permission, right? Okay.
Superintendent, do you have something to add?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The only thing I was going to add, Regulation 274, which you heard a lot about recently, it does, under that regulation, it did clarify for long-term occasional teachers the evaluation process that has to take place. And so our board has adopted our own review process for long-term occasional teachers that they have to go through. If they are in for 4 months or longer, they must be appraised. Anything less than that, they wouldn't, but 4 months or longer, they must be appraised.
Carabella.
Thank you. Also through you, Mr. Chair. So the online tracking system, just to help me understand it, so they so they don't have an interview, a voice interview. It's an online appraisal that's going on? Trying to understand it. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, they would go through, there's a number of stages they would go through. What we're talking about in regards to the online tracking system, it would be an electronic form that the appraiser, which would be the principal or vice principal, would be filling out through all the stages of that appraisal. Those hard copies of those forms would be able to be printed off, but the principal, vice principal would observe the teacher in the classroom. They'd have conversations with the teacher in regards to their practices, so there'd be many stages, and that would be all documented in these forms online. So it's no longer a written out form, it's online. So we didn't want to, right now we're using a program called MVAL, but we wanted to make sure it may not be MVAL all the time, so we just changed it to say an online version.
So it's a combination of face-to-face meetings and online documentation. Yeah. Trustee Quinn.
Has the board, through you, Mr. Chair, contemplated any opportunity for parental or student response in the assessment process?
Superintendent Overholt.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just thinking back, at one point in time in the process, there was. However, there is no longer. It was removed at one point in time, but there was an opportunity, and I think through that it was difficult to get that feedback and to get how it related to the evaluation. So there was at one point in time, there was an opportunity, but there is no longer.
You're not thinking of an amendment to incorporate ratemyteacher.com, are you?
Well, I was going to mention the growth
Quinn.
of such customer service and the ability to review every product and service that we consume in the world today. And I'm not certain why this product known as education cannot be reviewed in the same way that we do every other product that we consume.
Director Dawson.
Write a letter to the minister. They took it out of the regulation, so yeah, we can't do that. In regulation, we used to do it years ago, and then they changed it, so we're not obliged to do it.
Your advice to me is to write a letter to the minister rather than deciding around the Board of Trustees whether we think that's an important thing?
No, Trustee Quinn, I think if I understand Director Dawson correctly, it's that the trustees could decide to ask the chair of the board to write a letter on behalf of the board suggesting this change, and there's also channels via the OCSTA to make motions to do that. So it would be to agitate for a regulatory change is really what. Trustee Quinn?
Through you, Mr. Chair, would it be against the Education Act or other regulations to have a portal where students and parents could provide feedback on and assess the quality of their teachers? Would it be against regulations or the Education Act to allow a portal where students and parents could rate or what's the word we're using here, to assess the competence and quality of their teachers?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to go back to your earlier question about if unions had any problem with this. They probably would if they was. Is it impossible to do? No. Would it be something that it would be certainly something we would all hear about, for sure.
Trustee Carabella.
Thank you. Can I just have an explanation of how it worked before when it was in place? Was it a principal at the school, parents would submit little notes, or how did it function before?
Through you, Mr. Chair, from my recollection, parents were informed that their teacher was on appraisal, and they were allowed to provide feedback to the principal in regards to that. It was a written form that they would fill out, and it was somewhat of a prescribed form. I don't think they had an ability to kind of write a whole, and again, I'd have to go back, and it was been a number of years, but it was not it was pretty prescriptive as to what they could put in, almost like, I don't know if it was a checklist, but I'd have to go back and look, but that was basically the format.
Okay, so any other questions or comments about this policy? Trustee Rabenda.
Thank you. While this is an intriguing topic, parents always have the right to write notes to the teacher, to the principal, to the superintendent, the trustees, the director, for or against the teacher. They always have that right. So it's there for them if they wish to use it.
Any further discussion? Otherwise, I'll call a vote for this to go to December 5th for approval. Seeing none, so all in favor? Any opposed? I see no one opposed, so that carries. Thank you. And so now, item, I guess it's 3.4. But anyways, it's the rescind policy 2-06, my favorite policy, lunch supervision. Can I have a mover? Trustee Marai? A seconder? You still need a seconder. Trustee Antomasi? Let's discuss lunch supervision. Quinn?
I think I have to recuse myself from this, as I found out recently that my wife is a lunchroom supervisor.
Thank you for that disclosure. Anyone else? So everyone's clear with the change here? You don't think, Superintendent Overholt, did you want to speak to this one?
Just
all
through you, Mr. Chair, and lunch supervisors are certainly part of it, but I think it's in regards to just lunch supervision in general. As you can see, the depth of the policy that was there. Not sure if it is worth what is written on anyway right now. And again, we have that covered in many areas already. We just rescinded recently a teacher supervision policy where we informed you of an in-school staffing committee that looks after supervision. We have a process where we ask parents on a yearly basis what the routine of lunch is for their students, so that we're aware of at school. So it is covered. It's not like we're ignoring the need for this, but it's just, I don't think the requirement in a policy.
Thank you. So this policy has been in effect since I was in the first grade. And it's lasted this long. So I'll call the vote to rescind. All in favor? Any opposed? I see no one opposed. Any abstentions? One abstention. Thank you. Okay, so the next item is policy 2-21, cross-panel sharing of student information. Can I have a mover? Trustee Antomasi, seconded by Trustee Michael. Superintendent Overholt.
Through you, Mr. Chair. The policy 221, the committee that I had working on policies did look at this policy to see what changes needed to be made. And as we were going through the policy and looking at the purpose of the policy, and it was really to ensure the proper sharing of information. We realized that recently we had two new policies put in place, one records and information management policy and then one protection of privacy policy, which really was an overarching policy that really covered what this policy is meant to do. We do know we need a process in regards to sharing of information from grade 8s to grade 9s. But we do see as the overarching policy being the records information management policy and the privacy protection, but this to fall under as a procedure as to what steps need to be required to be taken. Because as you can see, there are some changes that we would do on a regular basis as to what type of information and information that would be shared from panel to panel. So we are recommending that this policy be rescinded but moved as a procedure in our procedure areas.
Thank you. And discussion? Trustee Quinn.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So those new policies, IO2 and IO7, do they have their own administrative procedures that would also conflict with this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, they do have their procedures, but they would not conflict. They certainly tell of the requirements that would be needed to safely manage, store, secure, and pass the information on from one individual to another.
Go ahead.
In the requirements of this policy, there's a lot of language of notice and family information consent forms. If it goes into procedure, do we lose the mandatory requirements that notice be given and consent be given?
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, that's covered under those two policies, that are the requirement of consent and the sharing of that information.
Anyone else? Otherwise, I'll call a motion to rescind this policy at the next board meeting. Seeing none, so all in favor of rescinding this policy? Any opposed? See no one opposed, so that's unanimous. Thank you. And now we will do the item formerly known as 3.3, Policy 2-41, School Uniform Dress Code. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Moved by Trustee Quinn, seconded by Trustee Michael. Questions? Let's have Superintendent Overholt discuss this first.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the policy that is being brought forward at this time due to the fact that we are going through a process where we are consolidating two areas in Oakville, St. John's and St. Michael's schools, and St. James and St. Joseph's. Obviously, some of our students go into Our Lady of Peace, but it's more a cross-boundary than it is a consolidation. Particularly in our St. Michael's and St. John's consolidation, we have one school that is currently has the uniform and the other which does not have a uniform. Part of our transition committee's mandate is to try to ensure that we bring these communities together so that at the start of September, as best as we can, that we have a community that is cohesive, that feels as one community, and to start the school year off where part of the community is in uniform, the other part is not, it certainly doesn't meet what we want to. We still have that, they're from that school and they're from that school. So the changes to the policy was to provide a mechanism for consolidation where a process could happen prior to the consolidation taking place, so the year that the transition is taking place, where a similar process that is going on right now with the school that goes through the process would happen with those families that are in the new consolidated boundaries, so that we would be able to have that process take place and determine whether a uniform would be taking place come September, or there wouldn't be a uniform. So that was the intent of the changes, and while we were at it, we also know that there was nothing in place for a newly constructed school. And what we see in our practice is in the first year of a school, they usually initiate that school uniform vote, and so we put that into policy that in that first year that they would be putting that vote to the community for school uniform. So we are asking that this now go out for stakeholder feedback so that we can bring it back to the next policy meeting in December.
Right, so that's the motion here to put it out for feedback and bring it back to the December 12th policy committee meeting. That's the motion that's been moved. Trustee Quinn.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. This policy coming back to our committee provides trustees the opportunity to, once again, remove the disingenuous reference to policy I-31, apparel purchases and fair labor practices. As I've stated here before, this is a disingenuous policy because it only applies to parents, and our board itself does not follow that policy for any purchases we make, from school chairs to football uniforms to helmets. There is no other purchase that our school board makes where we must ensure that fair labor practices are taking place. So I think it's almost deceitful of us to pretend that we care about fair labor practices when the only people that we are requiring to spend money to pay more for goods in our board are to parents, and we don't put that on our own purchasing policy. So I would move an amendment to this policy that takes out any reference to the disingenuous policy I-31, apparel purchases and fair labor practices, and substitute elementary schools must use the board's authorized uniform supplier to the board will recommend one or more suppliers. Thank you.
I can't allow that amendment at this time because the amendment that we're talking about is the one presented in the amended policy. That's what we're discussing right now.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. This policy has come for discussion at the policy table, and I believe already with an amendment in it. We have a motion on the floor to discuss an amendment. I'm not discussing your amendment before we do this amendment. There's an amendment on the floor. The board has brought an amendment to the floor. That's the motion that's on the floor. Have we ever discussed an amendment and have it shunted aside for someone else's amendment to replace the amendment that's on the floor? It wasn't replacing, it was adding an amendment to a policy.
We have one amendment on the floor right now. If you want to bring your amendment after this passes, you can do that. Would you like to discuss the amendment that's on the floor right now? Would anyone like to discuss the amendment on the floor right now? Going to call in a vote on the amendment that's on the floor right now. And then I'm open to other amendments. All in favor of this amendment? Anyone opposed? One's opposed. The amendment carries. Would you like to introduce an amendment now?
Yes, as you've all just heard, I will, through you, Mr. Chair, ask that we remove any reference to policy I-31, apparel purchases and fair labor practices, and substitute the uniform supplier, first line, elementary schools must use the board's authorized uniform supplier. 2, the board will recommend one or more suppliers for school uniforms.
Seconded by Trustee Mariah. Discussion.
May I speak, Mr. to that amendment?
Go ahead.
Thank you. through you, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask the Director of Education if we follow any fair labor practice regulations with regards to any purchases outside of apparel in our board.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would have to go back and get a report on that if it is the will of the board.
So the Director, do you know of any purchases that the board makes that require fair labor practices?
Superintendent Nagoy, are you aware of any?
We would have to check the competitive bidding documents and whether any of the requirements within the RFPs would identify that.
Trustee Quinn.
Thank you. Specifically, I'd be interested in finding out if we have any fair labor policies for our technical purchases, televisions, iPads, computers. Because I have concern about fair labor practices in those industries.
Trustee Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand what Trustee Quinn's concerns are, but I think this is a backhanded way to handle this. It's an established board policy, and we amend all the policies related to other policies that we change. So I think this discussion should take place by bringing up board policy I-31 to the policy committee rather than having this discussion at this point, because it relates to something that already exists. So we can't pretend that it's not there.
Trustee Rabenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was my understanding, probably from a previous trustee who's not at the table at the moment, that the whole issue around fair labor practices came from the secondary students when we first started this. So that did come from our students. They wanted fair labor.
Trustee Quinn.
Through you, Mr. Chair, then to Trustee Rabenda, then I would hope that we would follow the students' advice and use fair labor for all our purchases as a board, and not just for one specific item that we don't buy ourselves, but we force parents to buy.
Sure.
As Trustee Michael said, when the uniforms first started, when Assumption first started, the students obviously had a lot of say in terms of uniforms, because clothing's pretty important to teenagers, and so I think that's how it came about. It wasn't that they were studying fair labor practices with everything in general. I think this just happened to come up. That was the issue, and so that's always been in place because it was their request.
Trustee Michael.
I am echoing Trustee Rowe's sentiment. If you want to discuss it, definitely bring it back, but as a separate item. It's my opinion.
Trustee Carabella.
I do think it does make sense in that if we are going to apply it to one thing, we should apply it to others. So it would be interesting to know if we are doing it with other products.
Trustee Iantomasi, and then Trustee Quinn.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I think maybe I just want to speak to the spirit of the policy, and that was initially with the uniform, but I think what has happened, because we have that policy, it's filtered down into a lot of activities that happen at schools, and I still believe there is good conversation that happens at councils every month when they're purchasing things, that they look to that, because it is a known policy. So if they have a choice, I think they will make that choice. I don't know that in, technology and, if we're going to get into construction and all that sort of thing, I think it'd be nearly impossible to say that everything's going to be fair labor practice. But I mean, I think the whole thing as a board is to try to adhere to that in spirit as much as possible.
Trustee Quinn?
Through you, Mr. Chair. I won't respond to Trustee Intomasi's hope that school councils will look to our policy and decide how they will spend their money. If we don't follow a policy internally, I don't know why we expect parents to follow policies that we ourselves are not willing to live up to. And that's my main concern with the disingenuousness of referring to a policy that we don't follow ourselves and insisting the parents follow it. So that's my concern. I don't expect you to vote in favor, but I want to state again that we're being disingenuous in requiring parents to follow a policy that we won't follow ourselves. Thank you.
Anyone else? Trustee Murray?
Just with that statement, would you like it to come up again in policy, or you're fine just having this discussion?
I think my fellow trustees will state whether it'll come back for discussion or not in this vote.
Anyone else, or I'll call a vote. I'll ask Trustee Quinn to read his amendment once again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The amendment is to remove any reference to policy, let me find it again, I-31, apparel purchases and fair labor practices. In this policy, II-41, and that the uniform supplier, the first line read, elementary schools may use the board's recommended supplier, I'm going to start again, because the uniform supplier, the first point shall read, the board will recommend one or more suppliers that elementary schools may use. Thank you.
Trustee Murray?
I understand what you're trying to get at with the amendment, but and we can change the language in here to take out reference to that policy, but in order to accomplish what you'd like to accomplish, I think you need to go actually back to that policy and change the policy itself. So, like, I think it's one thing to look at this specific policy and say, and what I was hoping we could have a conversation about it is, do we want it in here referencing that policy? But I think you maybe need to decide like what you'd like to do with that larger policy at the end of the day, and maybe constrain this amendment to just this, or rescinding just a portion of this itself, a line in it itself. Just a thought.
Trustee Rowe?
Yeah, just to follow up what Trustee Murray said and what I was saying, my point is that by removing the reference in the policy does not negate that we have the policy, so schools are still required to follow that policy. So this is a waste of effort, because it would happen automatically if we changed or rescinded policy I-31. This is not the place to have this discussion.
It may not be, but I allowed it anyway. The purpose of the amendment that was brought forward first, the first amendment, was to deal with the school consolidation issue, which is a one-off. It's an exception to the typical policy. So my thought on this, and we'll vote on Mr. Quinn's amendment shortly, but my thought was that the other approach to this situation with the school consolidations would be to simply pass an exemption at the board level for those two schools to deal with the issue the way they want. The board can do that. It would require a 7 out of 9 vote for a policy exemption. So we could word a resolution to grant an exemption to those schools that are consolidating for the situation, because it's a one-off. I mean, we're amending a policy for a unique situation anyway. We don't consolidate schools every day. Not all of our schools are consolidating. It's a one-off. So that's just my thought on this. But are there any other discussions on Trustee Quinn's amendment? Otherwise, I'll call a vote on that. All in favor? Oh, Trustee Carr.
I just want to get that second. Just did the first part, taking out that fair labor policy. But what was the amendment? What was the wording for the under the uniform supplier?
through you, Mr. Chair, that the board will recommend one or more suppliers. What can maybe the secretary can read it back to me? The board will recommend one or more suppliers that parents may use.
Director Dawson?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there's a bit of a problem when we have a contract or an with a company for, is it 3 years, Roxana? Yeah, so you couldn't make that amendment now if we'd be breaking a contract.
Trustee Carabella?
Okay, because I was trying to picture how that would work. So a principal would say, here is our uniform from in-school wear. And they could say, you can use this is the official uniform, but you could also go to a retail store and get blue pants or a white shirt. So they would accept both. This is what this would look like. I'm trying to picture what it would look like. And would that be against our RFP? Our contract?
Trustee Quinn?
Through you to the director, does the board not have a way to get out of that contract? I believe it's 60-day or break in the contract with 6 days notice clause?
I would have to find the exact wording, Roxana. You may have an idea because it's purchasing is your department, but she might want to comment, Mr. Chair.
And through you, Mr. Chair, it's been since January that this company has been in place, so it's been 11 months.
I'm not talking about a cooling off period, I'm talking about the ability to get out of the contract.
Every contract has a termination clause and a penalty for termination.
I don't believe that's a penalty. When we were discussing it on the RFP process, it was that the board had the ability to break the contract with notice at any time without penalty. But that's my understanding.
The clauses for cancellations are more in terms of significant or consistent non-performance. We would be in a position to get legally challenged if we do break it with a cooling off period without those reasons.
Trustee Quinn?
That differs from my understanding of the contract, which said that if our board changed our policy, and I forget the gentleman who ran the RFP process, Dan, if our board changed our policy, then the contract could be broken without penalty because our board had a different policy.
Superintendent Nagoy?
I will have to check in terms of the change in policy and what that time frame would look like. To the best of my knowledge, that policy hasn't changed. The fair labor practices may not change the fact that we have one supplier for the uniform. So that is very different from going and saying we are canceling a contract with the provider for uniforms and everyone has the ability to purchase navy blue pants and white shirts. If that is what the uniform looks like at the school or for the school board, then that's something very, very different. If it is a school that has voted a uniform, then they have to use the supplier that the board, through an RFP process, has chosen, with or without the fair labor practices in the future. It won't be vendors of records, 10 companies that somebody can use. So it's either the parents vote for a uniform or they do not vote for a uniform at the school. But if they do, they will have to use the board supplier.
Right, and when the parents vote, they understand that it's a single source provider, so they can decline having a single source provider by just voting against the whole idea, right? Isn't that correct?
That's correct. Some schools have in the elementary panel, uniforms, and some have chosen or voted, the parents have voted not to have uniforms.
Trustee Carabella.
But that, just to follow up, but that's different than, the parents voting to have a uniform but not from a single source supplier. Are you saying that, a school can go to their parents and say, first debate whether they want a uniform or not, and then if it is uniform, then do another debate and say, do you want a single source supplier, or do you want, pants and white shirt? They cannot debate that. They're only allowed to choose the single source supplier.
Right, but they're aware of what they're voting for. They're aware that they would get the uniform from a single provider when they're having that. Trustee Trapes.
Just to add for your benefit, Trustee Carabella, when you go through, the big night about, before you do the vote, the single source supplier is there. So they ask the questions and it adds more impetus to, this is who we're dealing with, and this is the whole package, just so you know. Like McCarthy's was there, or in school where at some point shows up.
Trustee Carabella.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. So, are you saying that this idea of not having a single source supplier from a board perspective can only come up at the end of the contract that we currently have within schoolwear?
This issue has been voted on before, hasn't it? Has it been less than a year?
Thank you for bringing it back to the table for
Has it
further
been less
discussion.
than a year? Trustee
Point of order, Mr. Chair,
Yantomasi.
could we call the vote, please?
I will call the vote. I'm sorry? Trustee Quinn, can you read the amendment again, please?
The amendment is to remove reference to Board Policy I-31, apparel purchases and fair labor practices, and states that the uniform supplier, the board will recommend one or more suppliers to students, but removing the line, the board's authorized uniform supplier.
All right, all in favor of the amendment? One in favor, any opposed? That amendment fails. Good debate. Yes, Trustee Quinn.
I received a letter from a parent about the process by which this policy will come to the full committee meeting, and board of directors meeting, and can the director comment on that email that we all received from a parent?
Referring to?
It was an email questioning the policy that we have internally as to how changes to uniform policies will be made, and that it references that any changes to uniform policies will go out to school councils for their input before we make changes at this level.
Oh, today's email. The email that I received from a parent. Yes. Yes, so that regulation 61200, Superintendent Overholt, care to comment on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair. We certainly respect that. When we looked at the changes, we did not feel that the schools in the system had a direct impact on this. Obviously, the schools that were being consolidated certainly do. And after seeing it, certainly worthwhile to go out for that stakeholder feedback for those communities that are being affected right now, that they certainly have some input and should have some feedback in regards to that. We certainly do have a tight time frame to be able to, if this suggestions of revisions to the policy occur, that we do want, if it does take place, we do need it to happen fairly quickly so that it can get out to the communities and that community information meeting can take place and so on. So we certainly respect the fact that there are some feedback that has to take place, and we did change that. Rather than going forward to the board, we changed it to having feedback to the stakeholders.
Trustee Quinn.
Would this policy not also affect future potential closures and consolidations with St. John, St. Matthew, Holy Family, St. Marguerite, things like that? So why would it not go to all school councils?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it is going to all school councils.
The issue here is that this transition committees for the consolidated schools are beginning to address this issue, and they need to have discussions with their communities. So this policy will handle all future consolidations. The timeline is kind of short for those ones that are happening now, the ones that are already in process. That's why I say it could also be handled as an exception to policy. It could be brought up to the next board meeting if it's unanimous that it's an action item at that board meeting. It could be handled right away if trustees agree and they support an exception to the policy. And my thoughts were that the principal could handle the situation the way they want. Once we pass an exception for these two schools that are consolidating to suspend the policy for them, then it could be totally up to the principal and those communities that are being consolidated, how to handle it in that scenario. That's just my 2 cents.
And through you, Mr. Chair, just further, with our transition committees, it was a topic that has been brought up with the members, the parents of those committees. It is causing some anxieties in particular the communities that have differing. One has a uniform and one does not. So the quicker we could resolve and come to a knowledge for them as to what the policy would read, the better it would be for those communities. So certainly we'll get it out to stakeholders when it does go through the proper channels to get that feedback and bring it back to the policy.
Trustee Michael, sorry if I missed you.
Just a point of order. We finished with the action item, and we've moved on to an item that's not on the agenda. So can we move on to the 3 new discussion items?
Sure, we will. The question was just about stakeholder feedback for this policy and whether it applied to the whole. Yeah. Well, it was a question. It was the same question. Okay. We're done with the action items for tonight. Information item 5.1, Administrative Procedure 6-19, Admission to Schools, Superintendent Overholt.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this procedure relates to the policy changes, and particularly in regards to students withdrawing from parental control. So we did add some aspects of that within the procedure. As well, we made some minor changes to the registration and the process pieces, as well as added the letter and a checklist chart to the procedures, Appendix A and Appendix B. I don't know if it's attached with yours, but we also added that the letter in regards to a child who is withdrawn from parental support, and a checklist for schools to make sure that they are having all the proper documentation followed through and all the proper process.
Okay. Any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 5.2, New Administrative Procedure 6-93, Cross-Panel Sharing of Student Information. Mr. Overholt.
And through you, Mr. Chair, the procedure that you see is basically the policy that we had just rescinded. We've just made some minor changes to that procedure and have moved it from the policy to a procedure.
Any questions about that one? Okay. Seeing none. Okay, 5.3, upcoming agenda items for December 12th, which is also an inaugural meeting. Mr. Overholt.
Through you, Mr. Chair, just it is a small amount of policies, minimum amount of policies that we will be bringing forward, but we will also now be bringing back the school uniform policy once we receive stakeholder feedback, as well as, I know it's part of a discussion today that was brought up, but we're going to bring the Oxta memo in regards to the approach to cannabis regulation as well. So that was going to be on our next agenda as a discussion item, but obviously it's part of the discussion today as well.
Okay, any questions about those items? Otherwise, we'll go to 5.4. Quick discussion on executive compensation. I think that was Mr. Marai who brought that.
I don't know if I said quick. No, I'm joking. It will be quick.
You promised.
No, I just wanted to, the board was kind enough to unanimously pass the following motion on October 17th. Be it resolved, the Halton Catholic District School Board develop an executive compensation policy by March 2018 that includes but is not limited to a framework of compensation for the director and executive officers, and that provides trustees with final approval on all changes to annual compensation. So that's what we passed as a board. And I just thought maybe for next steps, I'm happy to make some suggestions on points in the policy that maybe we can bring to a future meeting, either the next one or the one after that, so that we have a framework we can discuss. I don't know if it's really appropriate for us to ask senior staff to write their executive compensation policy. So I'm happy to take that on, but I'd be happy to work collaboratively with any of you on that, so we have something at the table. That's all.
Would you like legal advice?
Yes. So I think some of just on that point, I looked at a couple Ontario regulations surrounding executive compensation that governs not only school boards but other boards. So I thought of including some language on that. But certainly I probably would have some questions through the director's office to our lawyers, or if we have already memos built, there may be some questions on the limitations to such a policy that we'd undertake. So I'm happy to note all those items so that trustees are aware of what's being asked. And if you have any other questions you want included in that, I'm happy to help coordinate that too. But I thought I'd just put it on the agenda so we can get this moving.
So you're looking for something to be on the December 12th agenda?
Yes, please.
As a discussion item?
As a discussion item, please.
So the framework of a new policy for executive compensation, based on what we've decided already. Okay. Trustee Yantomasi.
I'm just thinking quickly here, is that Stephen at Oxta might be a good resource because they dealt with a lot of the framework for the province. So if Mr. Marai would like to contact him, I'm sure he'd be very happy to help him.
Anyone else to discuss executive compensation quickly? Otherwise, item 5.5, volunteer hours. Mrs. Carabella.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, it's a topic that came up. Trustee Quinn brought it up, and he wasn't here, so I'm curious if we've gotten anything back. I think it was Superintendent McGillicuddy who was going to get back to us. So again, I'm just bringing it up to see when we're going to get some information back on what's existing, or to put that into some kind of paper to help students get their volunteer hours.
This was reference to a previous policy discussion that we had regarding this, right? Was there a previous policy?
No,
it was just at a board meeting, right?
It was.
Was that policy? Director Dawson, did you want to comment?
Superintendent McGillicuddy is working on that, so as soon as I'll remind him, and we'll see where he's at with that, because he's trying to make sure that we're all being consistent, and that hours earned through organizations such as Halton Alive, that was a question, so he's working on that. Okay.
So that'll be up for December 12th, something for that meeting? Okay. Anything else on volunteer hours? Seeing nothing, I'll move on to 5.5, marijuana on school property. Mr. Quinn.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. With the impending changes to federal and provincial laws regarding the possession of cannabis and separate from medicinal cannabis, that there I'm concerned that we will have adults on school property who will be legally allowed to possess a certain amount of cannabis, and students who will not be legally allowed to possess cannabis. And my concern about protecting children on campus, on school property, from potential negative impressions about the safety of cannabis in the presence of adults. So, I'm hoping that we can, around this table, have a policy in place that will seek to protect students who are underage and not allowed to access legal cannabis, and a way to ensure that any adult on school property isn't in possession of cannabis as they're dealing with students.
I think several school boards are going to struggle with this issue. Trustee Michael first.
I guess what I'm trying to say is it'll become legal now, so maybe this is not a good analogy, but we're not worried about staff bringing alcohol to school and kids not being allowed to have it. So why would this be different if it's legalized? No.
Well, how about we have an OCSTA memo, or we have what is in the what's in the pipeline for responding to this situation? Is there anything either from Superintendent Overholt or Director Dawson? What is upcoming? How are boards dealing with the situation?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I was just at, we had a lawyer speak to us, Keel Cottrell, just last week. The federal bill, the Cannabis Act, is more permissive than the Ontario Act, and from what I understand the talk, a person who's authorized, can possess for medical purposes in the federal law, but in the provincial law, as an organization, we're not allowed to have that on property. So it would follow the same process as alcohol or smoking. It's not going to be really much different than that. Tim probably has a little bit more information, but we're all like waiting for, Oxtis coming through. We're getting lawyers to help us follow through with this. So I share your concern, but the way we're treating it, is it the same as alcohol or smoking? There's really not a whole lot different for that point.
I'm going to go to Trustee Rabenda first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today we received a memo from OCSTA about the declaration that they want to go to federal sources, and I emailed that to you this evening, so it's on your email right now.
Superintendent Overholt.
Through you, Mr. Chair, right now in our current smoking ban policy, it does speak to medical marijuana. It doesn't talk about legal. So it says a regulation also states that smoking, vaping, e-cigarettes, and medical marijuana is prohibited within a 9-meter radius of any entrance or exit of a board-owned and operated property or facility. So right now we already have it existing in our smoking ban. Okay. We will have to look at what practices are and what legalities are going to be in place, because I do know that they are looking at certain sites such as schools, so we'll look at what they are saying and bring it back at the next meeting for discussion.
I'm going to go to Trustee Marai and then Trustee Quinn.
Yeah, and I really appreciate this being brought up. There's actually a very interesting local case of this in Burlington, and I know about it because I was working for the Burlington BP at the time when Gator Teds was brought before the Human Rights Tribunal in Burlington. He had $80,000 in legal costs. So this is a potential problem for our board, is my point, and I appreciate it being brought up. Basically, an individual who was smoking medical marijuana for medical purposes said he was being discriminated against. He was asked to leave outside the front door. So I think clarification on this, on what's going to be allowed and not, is helpful in working with OCSTA. But it took the guy 8 years and lobbying and then going through the Human Rights Tribunal to finally get his money back. So it's a potential liability for our board and other organizations, and I think it's better to get ahead of this and find out what we can and cannot do. But it's good that we're already mentioning it, at least in policy. So thanks.
Trustee Quinn.
Thank you. To follow up through you, Mr. Chair, my concern is about the age limit that the province will come down with for possession. I believe it's going to be 18, 19 in Ontario. So I'm not sure if we have students who are of that age. We may have. And secondly, if we have underage students who are in possession of cannabis, they'll be in possession illegally. But if they are caught with marijuana, then they could just say it belonged to the teacher. It wasn't mine. I'm concerned that we have to have I think we should have some kind of prohibition against marijuana on school property for all individuals. And if we don't have such a thing in place, I think we'll go down the road of potential problems if we don't have a ban on school properties.
So my question to staff then is how do we incorporate something like that? What is the best way and place to incorporate it into an existing policy on substances or on a separate policy, or do we want to gather information? But so that's a specific concern that to incorporate. So what's the best way to approach it?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the lawyers were suggesting that we're all going to have to look at our code of conduct, our discipline policy and procedures for school and staff, and also review police protocol. So it's big, and we can get more information, but it's coming out now, and we're just being supported as much as OCSTA is, as the ministry is, so we're trying to stay in front of it too. And we share the concern about having this on our school properties, and we'll look at how we can incorporate what you're asking.
Go ahead. So we have 7 months to have something in place. Just the clock is ticking.
Superintendent.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think I echo Trustee Michael's position is that I would think, and again, we have to go and see what the legalities are, is we don't expect our staff to bring alcohol to a school. And, to be able to possess alcohol and where that can be consumed, and again, I'd have to look more at the legislation and the requirements as where someone can partake in the use of marijuana. I would think there would be some restrictions as to where they can, and if it's similar, I would think it would not be in a public place. So if a staff member doesn't bring alcohol to school, if they're prohibited from bringing it to a public place, they wouldn't be able to bring marijuana to a public place as a school. So I would think it would fall under similar circumstances. So I think we need to see what that legislation and that legal requirements are before we can determine exactly, and again, we're going to have to go and do our research on that, determine if we need a policy, or if it is legislation that or requirement and legalities that they can't have it at school anyway. So that would be an issue we would have if a staff member or an adult brought it on site and they weren't permitted to bring that on site.
So broadly speaking, I'm just going to look for consensus on this. Is it fair to say we could have some kind of policy or outcome to this by the end of June, right? By the second meeting of June, before Canada Day, so the second meeting of June. Yeah. And for December 12th, for staff to bring the background material that we need to talk about, is that too soon, or we can bring what we have. We can bring what we have. And maybe some initial recommendations on how to proceed from there, because it looks like this is going to be on the next couple policy agendas, at least 2 or 3 times before the end of June. Is that do we have like a general consensus for that work plan on this? Does that sound fair? Yeah? Okay. Does that sound okay, Paula? Okay. Any objections? Okay. Okay, that's a good discussion, and I think a lot of school boards are going to be struggling with some of these questions. Okay, so I'm going to move on to, let's call this new business. So 5.6, really, it's use of school-generated funds. Mr. Quinn?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Following on the defeat of Trustee Carabella's motion regarding the funding of groups that are antithetical to Christian, to Catholic teaching, I wanted to see if there was an appetite around this board to formulate a policy that would restrict only the donations, the funds raised by schools and staff, so that they don't go to support abortion and euthanasia groups. So if a school is raising funds for a hospice, but that hospice also participates in doctor-assisted suicide, do you think that our school should be raising funds for that type of activity? So is there an appetite to find a policy that we can all agree on that ensures that we're thinking about where our money goes, where the money that our parents and our students raise, and the staff raise, and ensuring that there is a vetting process as to where that money goes to make sure that we're not supporting and funding groups that are against our belief in the importance of life from conception to natural death.
Comments, questions, discussion? I think the answer to your question is yes, that there is appetite. Trustee Carabella.
I second that, yes.
So then, Mr. Chair, may I ask that we get consensus among the table here to have staff bring us back what a potential policy for use of school-generated funds relating only to donations, and how we would ensure that they don't go to the culture of death.
Sure. So I'm going to take this.
The culture of death was the word I used, but that sort of it's papal language that talks about how society has changed. What did you say for death? The donations only raised by staff and students.
Any other comments? Otherwise, I'm going to propose. I'm going to propose a similar approach as to the marijuana issue. So, do we have consensus to move forward, either incorporating this into an existing policy or to bring a new policy regarding this? What does staff think about that? Director Dawson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Probably a new policy, because I can't think of one that would.
Because there is something on school-generated funds already. There is a policy.
Yeah, we'll look at both. We could look at the school-generated funds policy and see if we can figure something out, we can add to that. And if we can't, we'll come back and say it's a new one.
Okay, so is it fair to say, again, as using the same approach I'm taking on this as the marijuana policy, is it fair to have a work plan to say that by December 12th we'll bring some background material, an existing policy, a couple of recommendations on how to incorporate the spirit of the resolution that we had last week and today's concerns into a new.
Can I push it to January?
You want to push it to January? Is that okay? Is that okay with you? At the policy meeting in January.
In the meantime, I'll take on the same effort that Trustee Marai has offered to do in the executive, and I will start the process rolling and share it with everyone and look for input as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's fair to say for January?